One of the most interesting carbon mitigation technologies is carbon removal, basically sucking carbon dioxide out of the air. And one of the leading companies in this field is Carbon Engineering out of Calgary. It's doing some work, pilot projects, I guess, with Oxy Petroleum down in Texas. But the Pembina Institute has put out a new report, and I'm going to talk to Carson Fong. He's a senior analyst with Pembina Institute's oil and gas team. I'll talk to him about the report. So welcome to the interview, Carson.
Thanks for having me, Markham.
Now, this is fascinating, and I want to get started because, a lot of people have seen carbon engineering's technology. It's basically big fans, very huge fans, and that suck the air through it and removes the carbon dioxide and then buries it, sequesters it underground. Is that the only technology that we've got so far, or do other companies have a variation on that?
Yeah, there's definitely different options out there. So carbon dioxide removal, it's really a blanket term for a basket of solutions. Anything that can remove carbon dioxide from our atmosphere and store it in a way where it can't go back in so easily. So the one you mentioned, that's direct air capture. It's maybe one of the more prominent ones, but there's been a lot of development in other ways like carbon mineralization. So that is reacting ground up rock with the air in a way to make more rock. It reacts with the carbon dioxide in the air to sort of form pebbles that you can then use in building material. We've seen it in concrete, or you can store it underground. And then there's even ocean-based methods, notably ocean alkalinity enhancement, and that is sort of improving the way or increasing the way that the ocean absorbs carbon dioxide naturally by introducing some of similar rock material into the water.
Now, it sounds like from what you just described, and from what I know of the direct air capture, the technology is still pretty new, and it's still high cost. It's difficult to make a business case for it. And in your report, as I understand it, you argue for government policy and regulation and subsidies to continue developing the technology. We probably won't really get to deploy it at scale until maybe 2040s, 2050, somewhere in there. But as this is a wild card technology, shows promise, not ready yet, but we should keep investing in it. Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's fair. It's we know we need to do deep, sustained, immediate emissions reductions if we want any shot at meeting our net zero targets or staying within a 1.5 degree scenario. But at the same time, we know that alone is not going to get us to net zero, because there are hard to remove emissions that we really don't have solutions for. And that's the role we see carbon dioxide removal playing, is indirectly addressing the remaining hard to get rid of emissions by removing the equivalent amount that's being emitted. And then even after net zero, we see carbon dioxide removal playing a role in getting us to net negative emissions and starting to chip away at our legacy emissions that have been emitted for the past decades, and to start rolling the clock back on climate change. Yeah, and I think the point about funding it, we sort of have a lot of the pieces in place already with the carbon price, but the most of the offset schemes and pricing schemes in Canada, they don't recognize engineered carbon dioxide removal solutions. And so right now you can't actually get the credit for, if you've got a direct air capture plant, you don't get the credit for removing that carbon currently.
Right. And some of these hard to decarbonize sectors would be aviation would be one, potentially. So it's a lot of the heavy industry would be another, though I see we're making progress electrifying steel making, for example. So we are making some progress in those areas, but we're just not going to be able to get to all of them to net zero, likely, certainly by 2050. And my understanding is that you figure about 10 to 15% of all emissions will fall into that category.
Yeah, that's sort of the rough idea that the literature has right now. Obviously, the more we can reduce, the less we need to rely on carbon dioxide removal, and really that's the ideal case. It's certainly better for us to do whatever is cheapest and most available to drive down our emissions. And so, if that is direct emissions reductions, that's great. That means that's less we need to rely on some of these newer technologies that are, as you mentioned, expensive and maybe not fully proven. But we do think there's going to be a fraction by 2050 that needs to be addressed by other means, and that's sort of the role that carbon dioxide removal could play.
Now, I'm intrigued by this idea of taking legacy carbon dioxide out. So to get to net zero, let's say, just sake of argument, we get there by 2050, and then we spend the last 50 years of the century removing carbon dioxide. Do scientists think that we can get back to, I don't know what the 1900, the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere would have been in 1900, or, whatever. But can we get back to those levels before global warming got kicked off?
There are scenarios in the IPCC reports that see us rolling back a fair bit and keeping us in 1.5-degree warming scenarios. Um, it, it, it I guess the answer is it depends, and again, it depends on really how much of the reduction we're able to do. I think that's the key here, is that carbon dioxide removal on its own is not going to save us. We really need to do deep emissions cuts before carbon dioxide removal really can be considered as a pathway to get us to stay within there.
Sure, fair enough. Okay, let's talk about the regulation and policy and regulations that are required. So Canada has an advantage in that it already has a carbon tax, and it'll be up to $170 a ton by 2030, and it'll rise some unspecified amount after that. What else other than a carbon price do we require to make this work?
The big one is we need these offset schemes to recognize these new methods of removing carbon. And so, again, right now you don't get the credit if you've got a direct air capture plant, or maybe you've got a mineralization project that you're working on. You don't get the credit for the carbon you're removing, and so you can't sell that credit to anyone else within that program. And so that would be a huge step. What's needed for these projects to get financed is a sort of consistent, reliable, predictable revenue, sort of like a business case that these projects can take to the bank, and the bank can provide that financing. So on top of that recognition, even some assurance that the price on carbon is going to remain for the long term.
Now, the federal government is bringing in a contract for difference into the federal carbon pricing scheme. Would that be enough to provide that stable source of revenue that the companies need for the bank?
That would go a long way for sure. That would help add to the reliability and sort of the predictability of some of that revenue. Hard to say right now what's enough, or sort of what would get these projects off the ground, but that would certainly be a huge step.
Well, Carson, thank you very much. We're going to follow this with great interest, and particularly since there's a Canadian company that's kind of leading the way. So thank you for your insights.
Thanks, Markham. Thanks for the time.